Starting off this countdown, we have Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos is often considered the first female serial killer. She was found guilty of killing 7 men. She would murder them, rob them, and then drive home in their cars. Although she claims every murder was self-defense. In our interview, we can see how lax she is when talking about killing.
Just shot in self-defense, boom, boom, boom. You know, they weren't cut up, they weren't sliced up, no OJ jazz, you know. And he said, I did the most horrendous crime in the whole wide world.
Death and murder literally doesn't faze her at all. In fact, she claims that what she did wasn't even bad. Yeah, she tries to justify her actions by saying she just shot them, as if that's not a big deal.
But you've been convicted of killing 7 men.
Everybody's looking at the number.
Does that not, you killed 7 men, 7 strangers, does that not make you a serial killer?
So I didn't kill them every day, did I?
Again, she's acting like her killing 7 men isn't a big deal. Like, oh, it's just 7 men, people have done worse. It's crazy. Moving on to number 9, we have the Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez, otherwise known as the Night Stalker, was an American serial killer and robber who killed 13 to 16 plus individuals. At his trials, the judge stated that he never showed any remorse for these doings. I think the creepiest part about his interview is when he admits to being evil.
Do you admit to being evil, Richard?
We are all evil in some form or another, are we not? Yes, I am evil. Not 100%, but I am evil.
And we see him try to justify his killings by saying the government does worse things to people than what he has done.
Serial killers do on a small scale what governments do on a large one. They are a product of the times, and these are bloodthirsty times. Even psychopaths have emotions if you dig deep enough, but then again, maybe they don't.
In our 8th spot, we have Edward Edwards. Edward Wayne Edwards, otherwise known as the Hook Man or the Man with the Hook, was an American con artist turned serial killer. In fact, when he committed his long list of crimes, he never wore a mask because he wanted to be famous. In 2010, he did an interview and confessed to all his crimes. Again, it makes me so uncomfortable listening to how killers took someone's life.
Taking his hand, he's going through the bottom of the duffel bag trying to find the cigarettes, and I'm standing right here, and I have the sawed-off shotgun, and I ease it out of the bag while Danny's down there looking, and
He's just too calm talking about all of this. During the interview, he also stated that he wanted the death penalty and thinks that he deserves it.
I want the death penalty.
You don't want us to be in prison for a long time on everything else that's going on.
Right, I'm not a healthy man.
In our 7th spot, we have Paris Bennett. During an interview with Piers Morgan, Paris Bennett, who at 13 years of age killed his young sister, admits that he did this as a way to punish his mother.
Specifically in the end,
Yes.
to cause your mother maximum pain. This has achieved your goal, which was to effectively mean your mother lost both her children at once.
In 2007, Bennett convinced their babysitter to leave early and then proceeded to stab his sister 17 times. It's such a tragic case. What makes it worse is how he pretends to say he loved his sister. In the interview, he was asked to describe why he loved his sister, and he couldn't.
Because I loved her. I loved her with every fiber of my being.
They say it's like asking a colorblind person to describe the color red. They can't do it. He can't describe love because he can't feel it.
Exactly like she said, it's because Paris is incapable of feeling emotions. No guilt, no love, nothing. Moving on to number 6, we have Angela Simpson.
Right.
You murdered this man.
Yes.
You tortured him.
Of course.
This is an interview with killer Angela Simpson. She was arrested after torturing and killing a man in a wheelchair for snitching. During this interview, she tells exactly what happened, how she did it, and why. The scariest part is how forward she is about this all. She doesn't care that she's going to prison or that she killed someone.
You're not here to pretend to be remorseful.
Of course not. Why would I do that?
Are you remorseful?
Not at all.
She's not remorseful at all, and she's very open about everything.
To my house, walked him down the street. I don't know why the media acts like the mother couldn't walk. He walked very well. Walked him upstairs, kicked his ass.
Like, imagine being okay with taking someone's life. This interview sends shivers down my spine just listening to her and watching the stillness in her body and the calmness in her voice. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with Manuel Vela. In 2016, a 28-year-old man, Manuel Vela, was arrested after killing his girlfriend and their unborn baby. In this interview, you can tell that Manuel suffered from schizophrenia. He claims that the father told him to kill his girlfriend and her baby. Keep in mind, he is the father to her baby. And then he says that he is the Antichrist.
And that's where I cut her open, when he told me to.
Who told you to?
The father, it's just the same one who was to communicate with Jesus Christ is one he used here.
Although it seems like he is intoxicated during this interview, he is not. He's just experiencing hallucinations and delusions. In this interview, he also claims he would receive commands from outer space and extraterrestrials. A lot of people found this interview disturbing just because you can see how far gone Manuel is. He's no longer in control of himself. In our 4th spot, we have Arthur Shawcross. Arthur John Shawcross was an American serial killer in Rochester, New York that took the lives of 13 individuals. His first 2 murders were committed in 1972. He was caught for both and then sentenced to 25 years. But after serving 15 years, he was released on parole. That's when he continued on with the killings and took the lives of 11 different people. His interview is creepy for a number of reasons.
Do you remember killing her?
Yeah, possibly.
He gives me the chills. He's just twitching and his voice is just so unnerving. But it gets worse once he starts talking about his crimes.
How did you kill her?
Probably strangulation.
How do you know when they're dead?
How? I don't know, just do.
You can see that he won't admit it directly. He says maybe he killed her and maybe she died by strangulation. It gets worse.
Reach over my shoulder like this, right behind my neck, and I pull out a brand new machete. When she backed out, I come up behind her.
He's just a ruthless killer. In our 3rd spot, we have Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was an infamous serial killer who was responsible for murdering 30 women. Although it's thought that this number may be even higher. He would often kill these women in brutal ways. In his interviews, he shows no remorse for his actions, and the calm tone of his voice is very disturbing.
I can see how certain feelings and ideas developed in me to the point where I began to act out on them. Certain very violent and very destructive feelings.
Throughout this whole interview, Bundy tries to gain sympathy from the interviewer and the audience. You can see how he's trying to manipulate your emotions, which is terrifying. A lot of people commented saying that Bundy is trying to act human in these interviews. He knows exactly what to say and how to say it to manipulate you.
It was like something had, say, snapped, that I knew that I couldn't control it anymore, that these barriers that I had learned as a child, that had been instilled in me, were not enough to hold me back with respect to seeking out and harming somebody.
It's a huge reason why he was so famous and had a huge media following. And in our number 1 spot, we have Jeffrey Dahmer.
I desensitized myself to it. I don't know, I went to great lengths.
Between 1878 to 1991, American serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys. He would pack the victims' body parts into plastic bags and bury them behind his parents' home. He would also take disturbing photographs of his deceased victims and keep certain body parts as souvenirs. He also had tendencies to eat the victims. This gave him the name the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster. Upon searching his home, police found albums full of pictures of body parts, and his place was filled with human remains. Before his death, Jeffrey had an interview with Inside Edition and other news channels. In these interviews, he shares gory details about the men he killed and why he did it.
One time I brought this young man back to the hotel room, the Ambassador Hotel. Was just planning on drugging him and spending the night with him. Had no intention of hurting him.
What's creepy is how calm he is talking about all this. Like, he's murdered so many people and shows no remorse, just like all the other serial killers on this list.
I was handcuffed, and it was just the realization that there was no point in trying to hide my actions anymore.
Hearing him say that he kept the dead with him as long as possible makes me sick. When police raided his house, they found heads were in the fridge and freezer. 2 skulls were on display in the house, and they found a 57-gallon drum filled with decomposing bodies in his room. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Rose West. Rose West is an English serial killer who committed her crimes alongside her husband. He definitely also would make a spot on this list, but he decided to take his own life in 1995 after being arrested while awaiting trial. The terrible pair were investigated and subsequently arrested for taking 9 lives together, with Rose receiving an additional charge for another 10th life. During the court proceedings, against the advice of her counsel, Rose decided that she would testify herself, and what a trip that was. During her testimony, she sometimes was very tearful and dramatic, but of course an act like that can be hard to keep up, so other times she was cracking jokes and laughing. Imagine doing your type 5 while you're on trial for the worst of the worst crimes. Luckily, it seems as though the jury hated that as much as I do, because they came back with a unanimous verdict of guilty on all 10 crimes. Get this though, in prison, Rose West met Myra Hindley, which if you don't know who that is, she committed a bunch of very similar crimes with her husband as well, and the two became besties and even had an affair, but throughout this whole thing, Rose is still trying to say that she was totally innocent and that Fred was completely responsible for all of the crimes. So wild. In our number 9 spot today, we have Dennis BTK Rader. The BTK killer, whose real name is Dennis Rader, was one of the worst serial killers from 1974 to 1991. He left taunting letters for police and newspapers where he described his crimes, but thankfully this annoyingly large and misplaced ego is what led to his demise. After a 10-year hiatus from his disgusting crimes, he couldn't keep his mouth shut, so he began communicating with the media again in 2004. This communication, combined with his lack of knowledge on how technology works, led to his arrest in 2005. During his trial, he didn't apologize for his crimes, but he did describe them in full detail, which is horrifying and extremely eerie. I could not even imagine having to be there during that. After his trial, he ended up being sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences with a minimum of 175 years. When Rader was first arrested, when the police were taking him to the station, an officer asked him, "Mr. Rader, do you know why you're going downtown?" To which he replied, "Oh, I have suspicions why." In our number 8 spot today, we have Randy Kraft. Also known as the Scorecard Killer, Randy is a monster who took the lives of at least 16 young men between 1972 and 1983. The Scorecard nickname comes from how, after his arrest, police found a coded list that contained cryptic references to his crimes and the victims. On May 14, 1983, 2 California Highway Patrol officers observed a car driving erratically and suspected that the driver may be impaired, so they pulled it over. Once the car pulled over, Randy Kraft got out and identified himself and subsequently failed all field sobriety tests. At this same time, the other officer went over to the passenger side where he sadly found Randy's final victim, 25-year-old Marine Terry Lee Gambrell. The next 2 days of investigation revealed the horrors of what Kraft had done, and on May 16, 1983, he was formally charged with the one crime, but many more charges came in the next months. His trial first began on September 26, 1988, and on August 11, 1989, the jury rendered a verdict of death, and the sentence was upheld. As of this year, he still remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he continues to deny any responsibility for the crimes. Like they didn't find one of his victims in the passenger seat of his car. I think the gimmick might be up, Randy. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Sleepy Hollow Killer. Starting in 1997, there were a series of killings in an area of South Africa that are all believed to be linked to one unidentified suspect who's being called the Sleepy Hollow Killer. During this time, it was believed that 13 crimes could be attributed to this person, and despite investigations, whoever the perpetrator was, authorities were unable to identify them. There was a small hiatus from the crimes, which is sometimes referred to as a cooling off period, but in 2007 they unfortunately began again. While the more recent crimes varied slightly from the originals, authorities believe it is the same person, active yet again. There has only been one public suspect in this case,
but unfortunately it is no longer believed that he had anything to do with these crimes and that the one he committed was entirely separate. It really is horrifying to think of people who do things like this being able to get away with it for a number of years, so let's just hope that they are caught very soon. The good news is that a special task team has been formed in order to really look into these crimes and explore and examine all of the circumstances, modus operandi, and all of the material evidence. In our number 6 spot today we have Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. This is a double whammy because unfortunately both of these people are still alive, but the good news is that at least one of them, Paul, is still in jail. This horrible pair are often referred to as the Ken and Barbie killers, and while Paul started off living a life of crime, he quickly brought Karla into it as well after their meeting. That is not to say she is not just as guilty as him, however, because they are both fully responsible for their own actions. While Paul was arrested for a multitude of crimes, the pair were arrested and convicted of taking the lives of 3 separate people, one of them being Karla's sister. See what I meant about them both being responsible for their own actions? The investigation into the crimes proved to be quite difficult, with authorities having plenty of hoops to jump through, and this is why a plea deal was created for Karla. She had 1 week to accept or decline the deal, which would give her a sentence of 12 years for her full cooperation. She accepted. Both were convicted in 2005, and Paul was up to apply for parole in 2018, and in October of that year he was denied parole. His next parole hearing was recently on June 22nd of this year, and it only took an hour of deliberation to decide to turn down that application as well. I think 30 seconds probably would have been enough to decide, but I'm just glad the outcome was the same. Karla, on the other hand, served her 12-year sentence and then was released, like years ago. She moved away from Canada and headed to Costa Rica for a while with her new husband and children, if you can believe that. But unfortunately she has since moved back. In our number 5 spot today we have Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper is an American serial killer who was convicted for taking the lives of 10 people, including his paternal grandparents, as well as his own mother. Wikipedia told me that he is noted for his height, as he is 6 foot 9 inches, and for his intelligence, as he apparently has an IQ of 145, but I personally think that he is most notable for being an absolute monster. His first crime took place when he was just 15 years old, and that was when he took the lives of his grandparents. After this crime, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and spent time in a hospital before it was determined he was rehabilitated, and he was released at the age of 21. After his release, he unfortunately went on a spree where he would target young females who were hitchhiking. After his final crimes, he ended up confessing and turning himself in, which is something we really don't see all of the time. When asked in an interview why he confessed, he said, "The original purpose was gone. It wasn't serving any physical or real or emotional purpose. It was just a pure waste of time." 3 court-appointed psychiatrists examined and observed him and found him to be legally sane, and thus he was able to stand trial. On November 8, 1973, the jury deliberated for just 5 hours before returning a verdict of guilty. He has been eligible for parole since 1979 and has been denied every single time he applied, one time saying, "Society is not ready in any shape or form for me." I can't fault them for that. He is eligible to apply for parole again next in 2024. In our number 4 spot today we have the Long Island serial killer. Also known as the Craigslist Ripper, the LISK is an unidentified suspect who is believed to have taken the lives of somewhere between 10 to 16 people over the last 20 years. The victims so far that are known have been sex workers who use Craigslist to advertise their work. After the disappearance of Shannon Gilbert, police were searching an area along the Ocean Parkway, and that is when they began to discover the remains of the victims. The first 4 were found in December of 2010, with another 6 being found in March and April of 2011. As of December 2015, the FBI is now officially involved in the investigation. There has been a suspect in the case, but any formal charges have not been laid in terms of these crimes. The most recent evidence in regards to these cases was a belt found at the scene of the crime, which may potentially belong to the killer. At this same time, it was announced that new scientific evidence was being used in the investigation, but these announcements came just last year, so we have yet to receive any further updates. Hopefully the case is solved quickly so that the families of the victims can receive justice and this terrible person is off the streets for good. In our number 3 spot today we have Robert Pickton. This horrible person is one of the worst Canadians to ever live and is one of our country's worst serial killers ever. Pickton dropped out of school and began working at his family's pig farm, and this is where most of his absolutely horrific crimes took place. He was first arrested in 2002 and was convicted convicted in 2007 of taking the lives of 6 people, but throughout an extremely lengthy investigation, evidence of many more killings came to light. Unfortunately, in 2010, the Crown stayed the rest of the charges, but I suppose at least he was convicted of the 6 he was initially charged with. During his time in jail, an undercover police officer posed as his cellmate, and Pickton confessed to 49 crimes to him. Apparently, he was saying to the undercover officer that he wanted to take one more life to make it an even 50, and that he only got caught because he was sloppy. Which is super ironic, considering you're confessing your crimes to an undercover officer. The entire trial was a bit of a mess, but it led to a life sentence without the possibility of parole for 25 years, which was the longest possible sentence under Canadian law at that time. This unfortunately does mean that he will be eligible for parole within the next decade, so here's hoping that that never ever happens. In our number 2 spot today we have Peter Tobin. Peter Tobin is a serial killer who was convicted for 3 separate crimes, but it is believed his crimes may actually be up in the range of 40 to 50. Before being convicted of these crimes, Peter also served another 10-year prison sentence for other crimes committed, and he was released from prison for those crimes in 2004. 3 years later, however, he was sentenced to life with a minimum of 21 years for taking the life of Angelica Kluk in 2006. After this, remains of 2 more people who went missing in 1991 were found in his former home, and he was also tried for these crimes, which ended up solidifying his sentence to a whole life order, which means he will never be up for parole. There are some who believe Tobin is responsible for more unsolved crimes, and he has been labeled a psychopath by a senior psychologist. Apparently, while in prison, he has boasted about taking the lives of 48 people, despite the fact that he's only officially been linked to 3. Hopefully, if this is true, the connections are discovered soon so that the families and loved ones of those victims can receive the justice that they deserve. In our number 1 spot today we have Gary Ridgway. This horrible human being is also sometimes known as the Green River Killer, and his crimes took place somewhere between 1982 to potentially as recent as 2001. He was convicted for 49 crimes, but confessed to an unbelievable 71, which makes him the 2nd most prolific serial killer in the United States in terms of confirmed killings. Most of his victims were either sex workers or women in other vulnerable circumstances, and through DNA profiling evidence in 2001, authorities were able to connect him to 4 of his crimes. From there, they made a deal with him where they would spare him the death sentence in exchange for the disclosure of the location of all of the missing women. Gary took the deal and was spared a death sentence, and instead was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Not only did he say that he chose the type of victims he did because they were easy to pick up and that he hated most of them, but he also called his crimes his career. So, he sucks.
Coming in at number 10, we have Mary Ann Cotton. Cotton was hung at Durham County Jail in 1873 following a 20-year poisoning spree. Cotton is often considered Britain's first female serial killer, murdering 21 people in her time, usually for money via insurance payouts. Cotton's poison of choice was arsenic, something that she used to murder her husbands, yes, husbands plural, and her children. That's right, she killed her own children. She was later discovered when police made the connection between the loss of her 3 husbands, some friends, a friend of her mother's, her mother, and her 13 children, all of which had died from sudden stomach fevers. Coming in at number 8, we have Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley are evil for so many reasons, not least the fact that they are disgusting child killers, and they conducted their crimes in the 60s. The pair lived in Greater Manchester and spurred one another on to kill. Their first victim was a friend of Hindley's sister. She was called Pauline Reed, and Hindley used their prior relationship to lure her into their van. Pauline was only 16 when she was sexually assaulted and murdered. The pair raped 3 more times and killed 4 more times. Their victims included 3 boys, 2 of which were aged 12, and a 10-year-old girl. The pair were later arrested following a tip-off from Hindley's brother-in-law, and they later refused to give information about the missing children's bodies to their bereaving parents, which is just horrible. Okay, so this guy comparatively seems a lot worse, but he was living in a different time, although he was absolutely a mega dick. Coming in at number 7, we have Vlad the Impaler. Vlad the Impaler was the inspiration behind the legend of Dracula, and like his fictitious counterpart, he was a very bloodthirsty chap. Vlad was alive for a mere 45 years between 1431 and 1476, but In that time, it is estimated that he could have killed around 1,000 people. Vlad was Prince of Wallachia, a historic region of Romania, and to cut a really long story short, he killed everybody that stood in his way of power or threatened his position. He plundered villages and killed armies. How did he kill them? Well, he's not called Vlad the Impaler by accident. He really liked to impale his victims and then proudly display their corpses. He also impaled animals and nailed turbans to the heads of Turkish messengers. He was known to be cruel and wicked within his lifetime, with news of his evil soul becoming a popular story in German courts. Speaking of Germany, next up at number 6 we have Joseph Goebbels. Some say this top-ranking Nazi in charge of propaganda was actually way worse than Hitler himself. Deranged, jealous and erratic, Goebbels was a vicious Jew-hating killer who was a key player in defining the Aryan race and pointing hatred towards Jews. He was also fairly key in the establishment of concentration camps, including Auschwitz. This picture of Joseph Goebbels always haunts me. This is the moment that he found out the photographer was a Jew. At the end of the war, he and his wife murdered their 6 children before committing suicide. Coming in at number 5, we have Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy is one of the most prolific and infamous serial killers of all time. The American, who murdered somewhere between 30 and 100 women, was killed via the electric chair in 1989. Bundy raped most of his victims and kept souvenirs, including body parts and Polaroids of their bodies. When caught, Bundy gave a series of chilling interviews where he described himself as cold-hearted. He also revealed that he would decapitate some of his victims and then have sex with their corpses. Sometimes he would revisit his murder site and would again perform sexual acts on decomposing bodies. Bundy famously said, "We serial killers are your sons, we are your husbands, we are everywhere, and there will be more of your children dead tomorrow." Oh, this guy, gross. He seemed to take a sick pride in being a killer. Coming in at number 4, we have Delphine LaLaurie. Considered one of the most evil women in the world, let alone New Orleans, this absolute historic she-devil even got her own character on American Horror Story. Delphine grew up as a young, rich beauty in a wealthy white Creole family in New Orleans. After 3 marriages, she brought her own home and installed a slave's quarter in the top floor. Beneath the shiny veneer of her lavishly furnished home, Delphine had a sick secret. The slaves' quarters were actually a secret torture and murder room. She woefully mistreated her staff, but the extent of the horror wasn't known until a fire broke out in her home. The fire marshal searched the top floor only to find a dozen people chained up with others in cages. Body parts and severed heads sat in buckets and organs were strewn across the floor. Delphine never faced justice as she fled to Paris. A recent evil up next at number 3, we have Harold Shipman. Harold Shipman was a British doctor who broke the Hippocratic Oath and abused his power to carry out 218 or more sick murders. Shipman killed people by administering them with a lethal dose of diamorphine, and then he used his position as a doctor to sign their death certificates and also to doctor their medical records to suggest that they were in bad health. 80% of his victims were women, usually over the age of 50. However, Shipman has been linked to the death of a 4-year-old boy. His last victim was pensioner Kathleen Grundy, for whom he had forged a will, leaving himself in excess of £300,000. Eventually he was discovered and sent to prison in 2000, and in 2004 he hung himself on his 58th birthday, reportedly waiting this long specifically so his wife would get his £100,000 pension. Sick. Finally, at number 1, we have a man who is responsible for the deaths of 45 million people. We have Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was the founding father of the People's Republic of China, which was achieved in 1949 after a brutal civil war during which the Communist Party overthrew the government. Mao was cruel on so many scales. He tortured and killed army dissenters and peasants accused of hiding food supplies. But the crux of Mao's cruelty came as he defiantly pushed the Great Leap Forward policy, which aimed to change China from a farming society to a society focused on industry. Unfortunately, this radical shift led to food shortages, sparking the Great Chinese Famine, where between 18 and 30 million Chinese people starved to death. It has been documented that Mao knew that this was happening as the rice yield was not big enough to sustain the population. He is reported to have said it was better for half the population to die so that the other half could thrive. Ultimately, his rule saw the collective untimely deaths of up to 45 million people as a result of famine and corrupt practices he used to obtain and maintain power.